Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining the Tribal Law and Policy Institute and the Bureau of Justice Assistance for today's Funding Opportunity webinar covering the fiscal year 2023 Adult Treatment Court Discretionary Grant Program, presented by Greg Torain, Alyssa, Harrold, and myself. Next slide, please. I am Angie Juarez-Monger, Tribal Wellness Court Specialist with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. Next slide, please. Today we'll be reviewing the Adult Treatment Court Grant Solicitation. We will have an overview of Office of Justice Programs and the Bureau of Justice Assistance, review Adult Treatment Court appropriations, look at OJP and VJA priority areas, review grant eligibility, categories, and requirements, and we will be talking about grant applications to get you ready to apply for this grant. Next slide, please.
Our first poll to start us off is how many of you plan to apply to the Adult Treatment Court solicitation? So if you can, as soon as that is up on your screen, answer either yes or no if you plan on applying. Looks like we have almost everybody who's on is applying so far. We have 3 more participants to answer. Just give a couple more seconds here. So right now, 88% of you are yes, you're absolutely going to apply. And there's 1 person who right now is a no, and hopefully has a perspective that might change after this presentation. Everyone can see those results. All right, next slide. So in the chat box, if on the right-hand side, if you can please type in which tribal court you are representing. Great, I see we have someone from Little Traverse Bay Bands with us. Lake, Cherokee, Comanche, Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. If anyone else would like to share, just please put that below in the chat box, and those are being monitored. Next slide.
Okay, so what is the Office of Justice Programs? The Department of Justice has 3 grant-making components, which are the Office of Violence Against Women, known as OVW, and Community-Oriented Policing Services, known as COPS, and the Office of Justice Programs. The Office of Justice Programs provides funding, training, research, and statistics to the criminal justice community. Within OJP, there are 6 other offices, and the Bureau of Justice Assistance, or BJA, is one of those offices. Next slide, please.
So the mission of the Bureau of Justice is to provide leadership, services, and grant administration and criminal justice policy development to support state, local, and tribal justice strategies to achieve safer communities. BGA works within communities, governments, and nonprofit organizations to reduce crime, recidivism, and unnecessary confinement, as well as promoting a safe and fair criminal justice system. Next slide.
So today we're reviewing the Adult Treatment Court Grant, and you can find the solicitation on the BJA site and TLPI's wellnesscourts.org site. Next slide, please. Here's a graphic that illustrates appropriations for adult treatment court programs over the last 5 years. And we see that funding has consistently increased each year, with the largest increase this fiscal year. Next slide, please.
So right now there's 95 million available for adult treatment court programs, and listed below are the areas that are appropriated for fundings. We have our adult treatment court grant programs, our National Treatment Court Training and Technical Assistance, National Drug Court Resource Center, which is a great area to look at while you are writing your grant applications, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Preventions, and then research, evaluation, and analysis of treatment courts. Next slide.
OJP has set priority areas for this year's funding, and these are applications that address potential racial inequities and contribute to greater access to services for communities that have historically been underserved, marginalized, and adversely affected by inequality. Also, applications that enhance programming by providing at least 40% of the grant award to a culturally specific organization, and applications that provide resources to rural and tribal jurisdictions. Next slide, please.
So enlisted are the treatment court priority areas, so that you adhere to your National Association of Drug Court Professionals, Drug Court 10 key components and best practice standards, that you ensure equity and inclusion via collection, retention, and access of data, that you provide access to medication-assisted treatment, that you make all forms of FDA-approved medications to treat SUD available participants under the care of a physician. So that's something to note, that BGA strongly encourages you to provide overdose education and forms of harm reductions, both in your programming and application plans, supporting veteran and tribal communities, in partnership with local law enforcement. And something that I want to note specifically is serving your high risk and high need participants. Within your grant application narrative and budget, you can put in a validated risk assessment tool as an area you need funds for. Having a validated risk assessment tool is something that's going to really improve your programming, get your targeted participants in, and provide higher education and graduation rates. So that is something that technical assistance can be provided from BGA, and something you can use grant funds for. So highly recommend that you include that in your grant narratives. Next slide. So the goal of BGA adult drug court solicitation is to provide adult treatment courts and professionals in the criminal justice system with the resources needed to plan, implement, enhance, and sustain evidence-based treatment programs for individuals with substance use disorders who are involved in the criminal justice system. I just really encourage, when you're writing your narratives for your grant applications for new and implementing programs, as well as enhancement programs, that you look beyond the federal grant language for your documents and make your mission and vision statement consistent with your specific tribal communities and what the foundation of your programming is going to be to better serve your tribal populations. Next slide.
Within this grant solicitation, there's 3 categories you can apply for. Category 1 is planning and implementation. Category 2 is enhancement, and category 3 is statewide. As a tribe or tribal entity, you'll be applying to either category 1 or 2, as category 3 is for states. And also to note that veteran treatment court services can be supported through this funding. However, there's a note that you'll see later in this webinar about funding. If it's strictly for veteran treatment court, there's a different grant solicitation to be applying for. Also to note that within the category 1 and 2, there will be 2 application deadlines, and we'll discuss that more later in the webinar as well. Next slide.
So when you are going through this solicitation, make sure that your agency is eligible to apply, which for the tribal applicants, you are going to be a category 1 or 2, as Angie noted. So just make sure you are reading through all of the information and the eligibility requirements. Grants are really beautiful. They spell out everything you need and what the rules are for applying. Next slide. So just to note, category 3, no tribal government should be applying for that. You are going to be a category 1 or 2 in your application status. Next slide.
So why should tribes apply? Well, the solicitation specifically references tribal healing to wellness courts. We've reviewed how BJA has made a commitment to support tribal applicants. Also, within the last 5 years, more tribal healing to wellness courts have been awarded compared to the previous 5 years. So it's a difference from 7 applications to 2 in the prior grant period, in the prior period of 5 years. Tribes are also awarded more grant funds under general BJA adult treatment court and veterans treatment court RFPs than any other treatment court RFP, like the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. Another reason to rest assured is that peer reviewers will have substantial tribal healing to wellness court specific knowledge. So this means that the people who are reviewing your application will know about tribal healing to wellness courts. And also BJA offers tribal specific training and technical assistance through a TAU partner, us, the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. So this means that TLPI can support your project and its implementation after you've been awarded. Next slide. So this graphic shows what we were mentioning in the previous one about funding for tribal healing to wellness courts. And we see that in 2018 to 22, more tribal awards have been awarded than the previous 5 years. But you'll notice fiscal year 21 only has 1. Only 1 tribal award was made because only 1 tribal application was submitted. So this is just to know and encourage everybody to at least submit an application. You'll either get an award or it's a learning experience. And we'll talk about that a little more later in the webinar. Next slide.
So absolutely, tribes should be applying for these funds to help support your community. You want to make sure you don't miss out on funding because you miss a deadline. So there are 2. There's a grants.gov deadline that you need to turn in by April 11th, and there's a Just Grants deadline by April 18th. So that is really important to note that there are 2 different deadlines. I highly encourage you in your application period to put your own timelines with when you want your narrative done, your project timeline, your budget, so you can make sure you have all of your documents beforehand and that you make sure you're trying to submit before April 11th in case there's any signatures you didn't get on forms or any technology issues, that you give yourself some time to make sure that's submitted. Something to note, this year's solicitation is open for 99 days. That's longer than the previous solicitation period, and that was based in part on tribal feedback. That was a really tight period to get that grant application done. I know I applied last year for the tribe I was working for, and it was a really quick turnaround. So really grateful for the feedback that BGA took into consideration to give tribes more time to get this necessary funding. Next slide. All right, and then in your chat box, please, again, located on the lower right side of your computer, what type of tribal healing to wellness court service will you be requesting funding to support your program? We're going to go to the next slide. It's going to give you a list of those options and just put the numbers you think you're going to be applying for. We'll give everyone a couple minutes for that. So an example, if you're looking for recovery supports and evaluation, as well as transportation, you would put 6 and 14 and 9 in the chat box. And it does help to get feedback specifically from tribal communities so BGA can help further promote tribes. So information you give is used by them, just like saying the time period was enhanced. This is information too of what tribes are looking for. So we really appreciate the feedback. Right now, case management or supervision services, substance use disorder, recovery support services, temporary housing support, absolutely. Peer support, peer mentors, great. A lot of similar ones, transportation, drug testing, electronic monitoring, yes, very expensive. Great to be able to provide that to participants through funding. Typically, tribal members in these programming don't have the necessary funds. Amazing to be able to provide that at no cost. So you are reducing barriers to completion to programming, drug court staffing positions, necessary personnel for these programs. Thank you for everyone who responded. Next slide.
So we discussed 3 categories to apply under, and applicable to tribes would be 1 and 2. So here we have category 1, and this would be for new programming for planning and implementation. And the grant maximum request is $900,000, and the project period would be up to 48 months. 9 awards are expected. This category would be for projects that are ready. They're ready to engage in a planning and implementation phase of programming. The 6-month planning phase does include a foundational training that's required. There is some consideration if your program has already completed this foundational training, as long as it has been within the last 12 months, that would apply to this requirement. And you could apply for a lower amount and a shorter project period, but just take into consideration to maximize that amount, considering what your program needs, what your plan is, and just really maximize the amount of time that you feel that you need for your particular project. Next slide, please. The second category is enhancement, and this would be for established programs. The grant maximum is $1 million, which is an increase to the amount that could be requested from prior solicitation years. So this is a really great opportunity to improve your program and add to it. And think about all those things that you wish you could have in your current programming. This is where we would include all of this and maximize the amount that's available to you, both in the dollars and in the project period. This particular enhancement category I have applied to, and it's just a really great opportunity to bring the whole team to the table and do a wish list. Start from the wish list of, if I had unlimited funds, what would I do? And then you can work off of that to prioritize. So this is a really great opportunity for established programs. There is a small note at the bottom of this slide, which you'll see if you're a part of maybe a collaborative application, there does need to be an MOU that would specify who would be fiscally responsible, so the fiscal agent for the collaborative project. Next slide, please. And the third category is for states, so not really applicable to our webinar today, but there is that third category. Next slide, please.
Right, and making sure that you have the capacity to do the work that you're applying for, or do you need community partners to assist? Almost everyone needs partners. It's really important to identify those people early on. Our tribe used our behavioral health department as the partner. Angie mentioned an MOU. That's something that you probably have an internal process for in your government. That's going to take time to get signatures. Our executive department has to sign off on all MOUs. So we would give ourselves a 2-month deadline. That's how long that document takes to get signed. So knowing how long your internal timelines are for partnerships to get any signatures you need. And so you can be talking to them about what's important on their end in your grant application. Next slide.
Okay, so planning and organizing your application. So the first thing you want to do is really read that solicitation, because it has a good breakdown of all the things that are required in your application. The first step would be to make sure that you are registered in grants.gov, and there's 2 forms that you need to complete within grants.gov. And then next you can go on to Just Grants, and this is where you'll be submitting your application components, which include the abstract, the narrative, your budget, an indirect cost rate agreement, if that's applicable to you, some questionnaires, some other forms, and attachments. And there's a nice clear list in the solicitation, so you do want to be sure to read that and make sure that you see all of your requirements to allow for time to get those completed, as Alyssa had mentioned. Next slide, please. So the basic minimum requirements of an application. So these are the items that absolutely have to be included in your application. If any one part of this list is missing, it will not go on to be reviewed. So you want to make sure to include all of these basic minimum requirements, and that includes the abstract, the narrative, your budget form, and your timeline form. And we're going to talk about these individually later in the webinar. Next slide, please.
All right, and the requirements continued. So I know we have at least one other probation officer on this webinar today. So the grant, again, is rules. It's going to tell you specifically what you need to put in your application. You need to put your name of the treatment court, where it's located, the funding that's being requested, but no personal identifiable information. So you're not including your name as the grant writer or anyone who works on it. You are including your court's information, the target population, your 10 best practices, and where those are going to be addressed in your programming. if you have any other active federal treatment court grants. So this slide is really important if you don't have a strong grants department and you are working on this on your own, to make sure that you print off the checklist of everything required and you make sure you're really thorough of including the information. The 10 best practices are available on NADCAP's website as well as the National Drug Court Institute. So there's a lot of resources that you can utilize to help fill out these applications, as well as contacting us at TLPI. Next slide. And then just to note that there is additional funding if you are requesting veteran-related services, and to make sure that you put that in your application and that tribes are considered a priority area. So also put that in your application and note all of the maximum word requirements. Don't turn in longer applications. It's a 20-page maximum. I know that seems long. We would have to cut so much when we wrote these because you're so excited. You're filling out these pages of information and all these great things you want to do. Don't go over your word limits. There's plenty of times to include those in your materials and manuals later on, but make sure you don't go over the word limits in your application. Next slide. All right, and here we go, the proposal narrative rules. So they need to be a double-spaced 12-point font, no extra margins, can't exceed 20 pages. Make sure when you're doing your tables that those are also in 12 points. We would use a lot of tables to help us in our documents to make sure we're maximizing information. So that's something you want to be mindful of, but that also the proposal narrative does have different weights or how many points you're going to get when you apply for the grant. So there's the description of issue, your project design and implementation, your capabilities, and your plan for collecting data, as well as your budget. Next slide. So here's a little bit bigger, broken down. So when we would go through and write our grant applications, the area we spent the most time is going to be our project design and implementation, because that's the most weighted amount of points for your grant narrative. So that's the one where we said first timeline, internally work on your project design, and then the description of issue would be next. And then we'd have a great foundation to go through what is our capability and how are we going to do it. Then going into our plan for the data collection, and finally the budget. How much money do we need to do all of the things that we want? So the budget is worth 5%. So you still want to make sure that you have that completed and accurate. There are unallowable costs listed in the grant solicitation. So making sure you're only putting in things that are allowed to be funded. Next slide. Right, so just going through, the project design and implementation is 40%. And again, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat for us. So you want to make sure that you are demonstrating that your treatment court will have the ability to enter drug court participants into the program. That's going to be your key component. Number one, early access into programming. How are you going to have access to medicated assisted treatment? A lot of communities are in rural areas, so making sure that you have that included. What is your plan to address the opioid crisis? And there is something to note. Again, I mentioned this earlier, but the grant solicitation wants you to provide overdose education, take home naloxone availability and harm reduction strategies. So those are things that are strongly encouraged to write in your grant narrative, and how you will address racial equality and include data retention in your programming. Next slide. So, and then this is going through how you are going to be able to implement your proposed project. That's 20% of the application. And then the other 15 is going to be what's your current ability to collect client level data and outcome performance measurement. So that's something, if you're not currently doing, you can write in as an implementing program how you are going to be able to do that as part of your priority areas in your application. Next slide. I love the time task plan personally. I actually think this is really helpful to start with that checklist overview of what's the goal of your program, and then what are the objectives you're trying to meet. That gives you a really nice outline when you go to write your narrative to make sure you're including that information. So on the right-hand side, it shows you it is a goal listed out, objective on the left-hand side, what your grant activity is going to be, and who's responsible to complete that. And just to be mindful when you fill this out, I think person responsible is almost 100% of the time your grant coordinator. Make sure that you're giving realistic responsibilities to everyone so you can successfully complete your activities within the time frame you put in your grant narrative. Next slide.
Okay, so now that we have those required components of the application reviewed, how do we plan? How do you plan to start writing your application? A good place to start is starting early on that budget. The budget is very detailed, and there's a worksheet within Just Grants that will guide you to itemize the different parts of your budget. Be sure to read the solicitation, as a solicitation has some guidance on grantee meetings and travel that's allowed, and there's some maximums on the number of people who can do all of this travel. So you'll want to be aware of those limitations and be able to include that within your budget. You'll also want to know what expenses are not allowed. You don't want to include something in your budget that's not allowed with federal funding. So that DOJ grants financial guide is very helpful to review. Some of the things that are not allowed, just to have a mention to you, is prizes, rewards, entertainment, trinkets, monetary incentives. Those are not allowed with federal funds. Client stipends, gift cards, vehicle purchases, food and beverages. So you'll want to stay away from including any of those in your grant budget. Next slide, please. So your budget narrative should directly relate to what you have within your plan for your project, but also what you present in your budget. You shouldn't have something in your budget that isn't mentioned in your narrative. You want that to be a direct connection, because the people who are reviewing your applications know nothing of your program. So all they have in front of them is the narrative that describes your program and the budget for the funding that you're requesting to implement that program. The personnel costs in your budget should directly relate to key personnel for your project. You'll want to also understand the difference between sub-recipients to do sub-awards as opposed to procurement contracts. There's some different expectations there. You'll also want to make sure that you have all the funding that you need to fully implement your project. So there is a limitation. Again, the category 1 limitation is 900,000, category 2 is $1 million. and you don't have to request the entire amount, but you want to make sure that you're planning ahead of time for all the things that you're asking to do in your application. You want to make sure that you have enough funding for that. So again, leaving no questions unanswered for the reviewer. You want to make it very easy for them to understand what you're proposing to do and how you're going to do it within that funding. Another thing to note is that the federal requested amount that you include in your financial forms should match the amount in your budget. You want to make sure there's no discrepancy there, because that just ensures that you reviewed your budget and it's going to match the official amount requested in that SF 424 financial form. Next slide. More on the budget because it's so important. So you do want to itemize your budget for each year of the grant, but it will go into one budget worksheet. You want to have one for your entire project, but you want to itemize each year. There is a 25% match required for this particular grant, and it could be a combination of in-kind or cash match. You want to be careful to not overmatch in the budget, which means include a number that's doable. You want to know how you're going to be able to provide that match, because once it's in the budget, you're held to it. You're promising that that's what you're going to match. So you can explain the possibility of it being overmatched in the narrative, but you don't want to include that in your budget. You should also include the cost for travel and the accommodations for up to 3 team members to the 2 conferences or trainings to support your programming and the implementation of it. And you'll also want to note that you'll need to have prior approval for the conference and meeting and training costs before you actually do the travel. Next slide.
So again, just making sure that you are planning and really organized during this process. Again, I highly recommend internal deadlines for yourself. These aren't given by BGA, but that you make your own deadlines so that you are on a good timeline to get this submitted by those 2 different dates for grants.gov and just grants. So on the right-hand side is all of the application elements that you're going to need to turn in. So triple checking that you have everything beforehand. Reminders that you're going to need job descriptions and resumes for your key staff members, the memorandum of understanding by your key treatment court team members. So those are things that you want to make sure you have in hand prior to those internal deadlines. Next slide. And here is a list of all of the additional attachments. So the memorandum of understanding signed by a key treatment court team member. There's going to be sample forms on the NDCI website that you can pull off and use for this process. The fiscal agent memorandum of understanding, the Chief Justice State Court Administrator designee letter recommended. Ours had to come from our executive branch, and that was our tribal chairperson. So we needed a letter that she was supportive of this, and also that it had to go through our financing tribal council department. So those are things, again, to note for your timelines. A tribal authorizing resolution, who's going to do your research and evaluation. Your timeline web-based form is required. That's not optional. And then your key personnel, making sure that they have the credentials and applying those resumes. Next slide.
Equitable access is a new requirement And it's required that you describe a plan to look at access and retention data to identify and eliminate disparities. So within your narrative, describe the plan of how your project is going to ensure this. And you just want to ensure that there's equitable access to services for all of your participants in your Tribal Healing to Wellness Core program. And this isn't your requirement, but don't worry. Don't let this discourage you from applying, because you can receive technical assistance after award to get some help with this part of your project. So you'll have some assistance to meet this requirement. Just be sure in your application to include a plan for that. Next slide.
All right, and we have another poll for you. So if you are a enhancement application potential, do you currently have a Healing to Wellness court that collects and examines access and retention to identify and eliminate disparities in your program? So not to pick on LTBB just because I know they're on and I used to work there, that we would say, no, we don't currently have that as one of our data collection points. And that's something that was not required in the 2022 solicitation, but now is in the 2023. And I would recommend moving forward, including that information. Oh, and people are writing in the chat. That's fine. We can go to chat instead. So I see a couple indications of no. If people want to write in the chat, if they are currently keeping that information. I feel there are more of you, but I'm going to, oh, good. There's one program currently doing that. That's great. So, and like Angie mentioned, there is technical assistance for this. Oh, again, another program, yes. So data collection is wonderful. It's something that's going to help promote future funding because you can show a need in your community. It's going to be really helpful for programming. We don't currently have a wellness court, just looking to see if we can start. That's great. This is a wonderful place to start of what the requirements are. And for you, that's a great foundation. This is just something you would need to do moving forward. And again, data collection is really helpful. It's something that's going to help pinpoint areas in your programming you need more assistance with. We were really struggling in phase 3 of our program to graduate people until we started collecting when were people being discharged. We didn't know which week, which part of the program, and then we couldn't help fix those barriers. So it's something that's going to help your communities and your participants to be more successful. Even though data collection is not my favorite thing, it does help your participants overall. So it's a really great mechanism for your communities and for future funding. Next slide, please.
So another grant requirement is the allowable use of FDA-approved medications to treat substance use disorders and opioid use disorders under a physician's care. So this is that MAT part of the application, the medication-assisted treatment allowability to include in your grant application. Next slide.
So the Bureau of Justice Affairs does comply with all federal laws, and so do your programs if you get grant funding. So you cannot be in violation of the Controlled Substance Act regardless of your local or state practices. So really specifically, marijuana is going to be something that you can receive technical assistance about. You have to drug test your participants for marijuana. It is a controlled substance still by the federal government and something that is not allowed in your programming with your grant dollars. So if you're in a state where marijuana is legal or your own tribal statutes allow for marijuana, if you take grant funding, you cannot use any program dollars to support that activity within your programming. Next slide.
The violent offenders prohibition. So this is another grant requirement. And what this means is that grant funds cannot be used to serve violent offenders. And a violent offender is defined as a person presently charged or previously convicted of an offense punishable by more than 1 year and involves a firearm or weapon, death or serious bodily injury, or force against another. Another thing to know related to this prohibition is that it's not really within the best practices to mix the varied risk and need levels of your participants. So that's just something else to consider as you're planning your Healing to Wellness Court programming. Next slide, please. Here's some additional details on the violent offenders prohibition. And it applies to programs or activities that are funded within this grant award, including the match funds. And it's also applicable to a person who is presently charged with a violent offense. So for here, well, let's go to the next slide. This is just a little more. And you'll just want to take note that you want to consider your tribal conviction sentencing length of 1 year and the best practice mentioned of not mixing risk and need levels. Noted are 2 things to keep in mind. Not included in the violent offender definition is a person whose charges are dropped or reduced to a non-violent offense, a conviction punishable less than 1 year in incarceration, and the prior felony arrest. Grantees may use, so you could include in your programming if you use other funds for your treatment court program that serve these participants, as long as they're not some of these federal funds. And then you'll just need to track that closely because you'll want to make sure that you can separate the funds that were used for particular participants that's not allowable under this particular funding. Next slide, please.
Okay, and we are going to launch the next poll. So that should be available for you to answer yes or no. If you currently have a program, has the violent offender prohibition impacted your treatment court's ability to accept new program participants? Right, and we're at 33% of you have answered so far. I'd love to see 100% because that's a great data point. And we're at 50-50 right now. Just a couple more moments if anyone else wants to answer that. All right, so right now that was a split. Half of the tribes participating. Yes, it has impacted the ability to allow a new participant in the program, and the other half, no, it has not. So that is good data information and something to keep track of absolutely when you're doing your grant performance measures and submitting all of those fund reports. That's something that you're going to need to include in your information if someone wasn't allowed into your program because of violent offender prohibition. All right, next slide.
Should we go to the next slide?
It's like, I don't know how to make that work.
Okay, tips for applications. So within Just Grants, you'll want to read the how to apply instructions that are in the solicitation, but also reading the solicitation with careful attention, because it does give you some really good guidance on how to submit your application. Next is the SF 424 form. This is one of those fiscal forms that need to be completed. And so you'll want to make sure that you have the correct entity ID number. And this is something that your contracts and grants office or finance department would have. And they can help you with getting that correct number. Also, you'll want to make sure that the amount of funding that you're requesting in your budget matches that form. You don't want to leave any room for error there. So just ensure that those two numbers match. And also the allowable costs. You'll want to know what's allowed and, more importantly, what's not allowed. So you're not including any of the unallowable costs within your budget. And again, you can find that within the solicitation and also in the financial guide. Next slide. We mentioned this before, but knowing within your budget if you're actually asking for a sub-award fund or a procurement contract, and they just have different responsibilities for which section you'll want to put them under. A procurement contract is the service, just simply a strict service that's being provided that helps within your program. But it could be a sub-award if the entity or the group that you're sub-awarding to has equal responsibility to meeting your goals and objectives. So you want to just think about the role that's going to play within your project and then put the funding for that particular item in the correct area. The budget and match. So you'll just want to make sure that you have 25% included, because that's the requirement, but also keep it clear if it's the match, which are non-federal funds, or if it's part of the funding that you're requesting, which would be the federal funds. And lastly, make sure that your application attachments are easy to find. Do some good, clear titles on those. You want your peer reviewer to be able to go exactly to that attachment that's being referred to or that needs to be reviewed without having to search for it. Next slide. Some more things about the attachments that are commonly seen. Disclosure of pending applications. You want to disclose if you have any other applications in the works that you don't know about. You'll want to address similar funding requests, making sure that you're not requesting for the same things, because that would be supplanting and that's not allowed. You'll have to include additional attachment if you're requesting funds for an outside evaluator, and that's this titled Research and Evaluation Independence and Integrity Statement attachment if you are proposing to do that. You'll also want to include the number of participants that you're proposing to serve each quarter, and you do that in your timeline form. And that timeline form is something that's within Just Grants. Next slide. And just some final tips. Check all of the resources that you have links to. That solicitation has several helpful links for you to refer to as you're writing your application. If there's a title to something you're unsure about, just go in that application, in that solicitation, and click the link, and it takes you right to it. Also using the scoring criteria as a general guide for how many pages to devote to that section. I think Alyssa mentioned that, because you'll want to pay special attention to the parts that are scored more heavily. Don't wait for the deadline to apply. First of all, take note that there's two deadlines, one in grants.gov and one in Just Grants. But even prior to that, we know that tribal organizations have different internal approval processes, and there's things to consider like tribal council breaks or authorize people to sign. So you want to make sure that you get all of your proper approvals internally and allow time to get that tribal resolution to attach to your application. So Alyssa mentioned giving themselves an earlier deadline. That's a really great tip and best practice so that you can make sure that it's all completed in time. Go back and review your budget after you complete your narrative. Make sure that it all makes sense, that you refer to it in your narrative and that it coordinates with what you're saying in your budget. Read your narrative, read it out loud, Alyssa suggested earlier, because when you're writing, that excitement and just knowing your program, it's easy to miss things, leaving things out, or it makes sense in your head, but keep in mind that the person reading your application knows nothing of your program. So read it out loud with your review committee, with your partner, to make sure that it all makes sense and flows nicely. Focus on your attachments. Those are the extra information that you're providing to the reviewer, particularly the time task plan, because that identifies what you're doing, when, who's responsible. So pay attention to those too, even though it's not part of the actual application. Those provide important information to your reviewers. And lastly, put everything in a PDF format. Then you can ensure that nothing gets moved around with different programs that are opening, or you accidentally delete something. So PDF your application, and then it's a nice clean look when your reviewer goes to open it and read it. Next slide.
So just make sure that you don't miss out on funding because you made a mistake that made your application not eligible for the review process, that you forgot documentation or you missed a deadline. Don't forget to attach your narratives and your budget and your task plan. I think something that I really appreciated when I read the common mistakes was inconsistencies with different writers by different sections. These are long documents. You will have different people helping you. You don't want there to be two really different tones or different phrases. Maybe you refer to it as the Behavioral Health Center and they're still calling it the old name. So your narrative doesn't flow well and it's confusing to the reviewer. Make sure that the budget and the activities make sense. If you're saying you're going to go to 2 trainings and that's put in your budget with the cost, and you never talk about how that's going to promote your priority areas of funding, that's going to be something that's unclear to the reviewer. The grant lays out exactly where information should be included in each section. So just go through that really carefully and make sure you're following all the requirements and that you have your performance measures included. So you want to make sure you're testing 100% of all participants. There are some really clear measurable data marks you can make. Just include those in your application. Next slide. If for some reason you're not successful in your grant application, you can ask for comments to be provided and really recommend that you keep your prior proposals and why you were not successful in your application. Becoming a peer reviewer is a great way to get more familiar with grant writing and the requirements, and also looking at what the capacities of your program are. That's something that's really helpful the next time around. So there is information and technical assistance to help you with this process or in your future solicitation attempts. So make sure that you keep all that information when you're going through this process, because grant funding is awarded in the next cycle. So you want to make sure that you're eligible again the next time you apply. Next slide.
So here's some additional resources available in writing your application. Next slide. Here are 5 different resources that could be helpful to you, but I wanted to highlight 2 of them. And the first is the National Association of Drug Court Professionals Best Practice Standards. And it is lengthy. There's 2 volumes, but as you're writing your application, you could refer to a particular section, so a topic within your program, your target population, equity and inclusion, incentives and sanctions, and get some guidance within that particular section. And then as you're developing the program or enhancing your program, you can later go back and read the specifics to be able to implement them. But this is just a good resource to get some support and guidance by topic. And the second one to recommend is the 10 key components for adult drug courts. And the Tribal Law and Policy Institute also has key components for tribal healing to wellness courts. So that would those 2 resources are highly recommended to be able to refer to as you're writing your grant application. But of course, there's also great information in the other 3 that are listed there. Next slide, please. Here's a link where you can find previous recordings for grant applications and different slides if you would like to review additional information from prior years. Next slide.
And then we will go through our wellness court resources. Next slide. You can go to wellnesscourts.org and look over all of our information available from TLPI. It serves as a great opportunity for what tribes have funding, the tribal key components, and includes forms and policies as well. Next slide. So, and these are just examples of our current publications that are out. Highly recommend reviewing these. Our newest publication is the Intergovernmental Collaboration. That's very helpful for your state tribal partnerships. So we recommend when you have time reviewing these documents. Next slide.
And if you find yourself needing some assistance with grants.gov, here's the contact information. So this would be good to keep handy, write it on your solicitation up front or something. But here's the phone number. There's also an email address. And I've actually used both and I prefer email, but both of them I was able to get response and some assistance in. So just keep those handy. Next slide. Some more resources for grant applications are listed here on these links. Particularly the grant application resource guide would be really helpful to everyone. Next slide.
And then you can stay connected by texting your email address to the number listed to subscribe to messages and updates. There's also a social media, Facebook and Twitter, and more information on the BGA website, bga.ojp.gov. Next slide. Recommend getting on the court's mailing list. That's helpful information that will be sent out to you so you can get updates on TLPI events, publications, and when those federal funding opportunities are available, as well as our training and technical assistance events. Next slide. So here is a reference of our important contacts, and that's information you can find on the webinar again or on all of the websites listed. Next slide.
So questions, that's all the content we have for you today, but please feel free to ask any questions. You can put them in the Q&A box and the chat box, or you can raise your Zoom hand icon and you will be unmuted to ask your question. And I'll just give some time for that. Give another minute. I'm not seeing any questions. Okay. Well, if there are no questions, if we could go to the next slide, please. This is an evaluation code. If you could scan that with your phone, or you can click on the link that Janice just put in the chat box for everybody. We just appreciate the feedback and know how we can better support you next time. But that's all we have for today. Thank you everyone for attending today's funding opportunity webinar covering the fiscal year 2023 Adult Treatment Court Discretionary Grant Program. A recording of this webinar will be posted on wellnesscourts.org and will be sent out in our mailing list. Thank you everyone. Have a great afternoon.